We've been celebrating Cigar Oktoberfest the entire month of October. We celebrate one of the world's finest libations, beer. And the question is, how do we get from this, which is malted barley, the basis of beer, to the final product, which is what we enjoy so much, cool, refreshing, tasty beer? Well, I'm at Dunedin Brewery in Dunedin, Florida, the Tampa Bay area, and I'm joined by Michael Bryant, the owner of Dunedin Brewing. We've got Ricky Krantz, the head brewmaster, and we are going to learn today how beer, one of the most popular beverages in the world, is made. So, Ricky, this is the basis right here. It all starts with the malted barley.
That's correct. Now, malted barley is just a grain, and to malt it, a maltster is going to take it and germinate it or sprout it, and that creates enzymes that are important later. Now, to stop that process before it becomes a plant, they dry it out and kiln it or roast it, and that gives it the different colors that you see. And that's going to determine the color over here as well. Now,
so more of the darker barley, it's going to be a darker looking beer.
That's correct. But it doesn't take a whole lot of dark barley. What you're holding is actually the recipe for a stout.
That's a stout right here?
Basically, yes.
I would think this would be more like an ale.
Well,
or a lager. That's true. Or like a lager. I mean, something that's lighter in color. But
no, it doesn't take a lot of that dark malt to make a very dark beer.
All right.
So we get that grain in these 50-pound sacks. And each one of those is a seed, so we have to split it open and get at the starches and enzymes that are inside. So we'll run it through a roller mill, and then we'll travel up through a pipe onto the top of our mash tun, which has a grist bin up there. And then it'll start falling down into the mash tun.
Step 2, the malted barley goes into the mash tun. Ricky, tell us how it works.
That is correct. As that grain is falling down into the mash tun, we're going to be constantly hydrating it with hot water. And that hot water is important because those enzymes that were created are only active above 120 degrees. So we get all that grain falling down in here, and we're going to stir it the entire time with big stainless steel paddles to make sure there's no dry spots and everything's an even temperature. Once we've got it all in there with all of our water, we're going to let it rest for just about an hour, and that's called a saccharification rest. That's where all those enzymes convert that starch into sugar, and we wind up with a very sweet liquid mixed in with this mash that's called wort. And wort is the baby beer. That's the product that we're trying to get out of this mash. Now, there's no moving parts to this. Essentially a giant Mr. Coffee. So after that hour, we're going to start rinsing that grain with hot water as we're draining it out and filling up our kettle.
Step 3 in the process of making beer, the baby beer or the wort has to go into the kettle. Ricky, I've got a giant paddle in my hand. I meant the kettle. I can hear the echo in here. It's a giant kettle. What does this do?
Well, that paddle is actually used in the mash. That's what we stir the mash with. So the kettle itself is where we boil the wort, and we boil wort for a few different reasons. The main one is going to be sanitation. You can't have any outside microbes or bacteria inside of the beer because it's going to probably taste awful and make you sick. We also boil so that we can add hops, and the hops are really the spice of beer. They're not used for much else. Now, depending on what type of hop you're going to use, it varies from flavor to flavor. Just the region that the hop was grown in has a great effect on how it's going to act in the beer, or how it's going to taste, or how much bitterness is even going to impart. We boil for 1 hour, and then after that, we're going to transfer it through a heat exchanger and into a fermenter for fermentation.
We're now at the fermentation tank, where step 4 in the beer making process occurs. Step 1, we learned the malted barley is split. Step 2, it goes to the mash tun with water. Step 3, it goes into the kettle. And then that's where you have the wort or the baby beer. And then once that's done, it's got to go here to the fermentation tank. Ricky, fermentation, I would assume, is where we actually get that nice, lively beer taste.
That is correct. After the kettle, it's going to be transferred through a heat exchanger and cooled down rapidly to a fermentation temperature. And then it's going to go into one of these tanks here. Now, inside of these tanks, all what we do is pitch our yeast, and our house yeast is normally an ale. And then we're going to just make sure it stays at the proper temperature and essentially forget about it for a week to 10 days. During that week to 10 days, active fermentation is going to take place, and that's where the yeast metabolizes all the sugar, produces all the alcohol and carbon dioxide, as well as some other flavors.
Do you have to check on it during that time, or is it just left alone?
We always check everything here. It's a constant babysitting process, but the yeast pretty much takes care of itself. And
there's no tasting during that process, or do you actually take a sample, draw a sample?
We do draw samples, but normally we're just checking for any stresses or anything like that. It's not a common practice.
Ricky, you mentioned that you primarily use ale yeast in the fermentation process. There's also lager yeast, and they ferment differently, one at the top, one at the bottom. Explain that.
That's correct. Ale yeast is going to eat from the top at a much warmer temperature, and it's also going to create a more full-bodied, flavorful beer normally. Whereas a lager eats from the bottom at much cooler temperatures, and it's going to produce usually a more crisp, clean flavor.
So ales we can consider a little bit more robust, whereas the lagers a little bit smoother. And is there any difference in terms of difficulty in brewing or fermenting either an ale or a lager?
For a smaller production brewery like us, lagers generally take longer because they ferment at cooler temperatures. So it's more productive for us to use ale yeast, as well as we prefer a much more full-bodied, flavorful beer. But lagers are great as well.
We're very close to the finished product of beer, but we're at step 5, and that is bright beer. Now, I will tell you this, Ricky, this beer tastes very bright and delicious to me, but I have a feeling that's not exactly what that means.
Not quite. After fermentation, we're going to chill that beer down, and then we'll age it for a couple of weeks and then transfer it into here. And bright beer is just a name for a beer that's been through that process of being chilled down and aging. Generally, that's going to clarify it. We don't filter or pasteurize any beers. So once we put it in our bright beer tank, we're ready to carbonate it. So we just take a carbonation stone, put that onto the tank, pressurize that with CO2, and that's going to create a bunch of bubbles. Now, some of those bubbles are going to latch on the solution, and some are going to float down in headspace. So we usually will bleed a little bit of CO2 off just to keep a continuous bubble. And that process takes between 14 to 18 hours to get a draft beer. Now, if you were to naturally carbonate that through the use of yeast and more sugar, it could take up to 2 weeks. So this is
Accelerates the process.
Yeah, and we don't really have time.
And the last process, the very final step before I can enjoy this delicious, cool, refreshing libation, it has to be either bottled or put into the keg.
That's correct.
14 to 21 days after the malted barley is first cracked and put into the mash tun, 6 steps later, it becomes this, bottled or keg beer. This is 160 pounds. Good thing I ate my Wheaties this morning. And this has the pale ale that I will enjoy. And Michael and Ricky, you also have your growlers. Now, not every craft brewery has a bottle or canning operation, so you actually could put these in growlers in the state of Florida. They're 1-gallon bottles, and people can actually come here with their own bottle or their growler, and you'll fill them up. And I'm sure you'll refill them as many times as they want.
We love that. We're good for that.
Exactly. So 6 steps later, this is the final product. Ricky, this is a pale ale.
That's correct.
And I'm looking at this. This has got a nice golden color to it. Wonderful, fruity, very fresh bouquet on the nose. So 21 days later, I have in my hand the final product. A beautiful pale ale, nice golden caramel color. Very fruity, fresh, crisp bouquet on the nose. I'll say cheers. That is cool and refreshing. Nice job.
Thank you.
Now, one thing, please hold that, Ricky, if you'd be so kind. I think I'd rather take this one home with me than the rest of that, so I can enjoy it later.
That makes sense.
Michael Bryant, Ricky Krantz of Dunedin Brewery, Cigar Dave the General. Hope you enjoyed this tour of how beer, one of the world's most popular libations, is made.